Some people believe old houses remember the people who love them, and that if you listen long enough, they might tell you a story no one else was meant to hear. The cabin stood alone at the edge of Black Hollow Ridge, hidden beneath towering pines and the first colors of late October. Wind moved quietly through the branches, carrying the scent of cedar, damp leaves, and the distant promise of rain. Most folks in the nearest town avoided the place. They said it had been empty for over 50 years, ever since the old owner vanished without leaving behind a family or a farewell. The windows had long since turned cloudy with dust, and the porch leaned slightly to one side, as though the whole building had grown tired of waiting. Ethan Calloway slowed his old pickup at the end of the gravel trail and rested one hand on the steering wheel. Beside him sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose silver and cream coat caught the fading afternoon light. The dog's amber eyes never stopped moving. He watched the trees, the cabin, the sky, studying the world with the quiet discipline of an old soldier. Ethan understood that look. Ranger had once worked search and rescue overseas, and even now the dog noticed things long before people did. Ethan stepped out of the truck, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The air felt colder here than it had a mile down the road. Not dangerous, just different. He looked at the cabin and let out a slow breath. It had cost him less than a used fishing boat. Most people would have called it a mistake. To Ethan, it felt like one last chance to start over. Since coming home from the army, he had drifted from one temporary job to another, fixing fences, repairing barns, rebuilding things that other people had forgotten. Somehow it had always been easier to mend broken wood than broken memories. The only constant through all those years had been Ranger. The dog jumped down from the truck and landed softly beside him. His nose lifted into the wind. For a moment he simply stood there, perfectly still. Then his ears turned toward the cabin. Ethan smiled faintly. "You hear something, boy?" Ranger did not move. He did not bark. He simply stared. Together they climbed the old porch steps. The boards creaked under Ethan's weight, but the sound was strangely comforting, like an old friend clearing his throat after years of silence. The front door opened with surprising ease. Inside, the cabin smelled of old pine, cold stone, and the dust of forgotten winters. Shafts of golden evening light slipped through the windows, turning floating specks into tiny stars. There was almost nothing inside. A stone fireplace, a wooden table, a rocking chair resting near the window. It looked less abandoned than paused, as though someone had stepped outside years ago expecting to return before supper. Ethan set his backpack down and walked slowly through the rooms. The floorboards groaned beneath him, but the cabin felt solid. Whoever built it had built it to last. Ranger padded silently across the room, nails clicking softly against the old wood. He sniffed the fireplace. He sniffed the corners. Then he stopped. His body became rigid. His ears stood tall. Ethan followed the dog's gaze upward. A narrow staircase disappeared into the shadows above. At the top was a single wooden door. It was smaller than he expected, painted white long ago, but now faded almost gray. A heavy iron lock hung from the handle, untouched by rust, strangely newer than everything around it. "Guess somebody wanted to keep the raccoons out," Ethan muttered. Ranger did not react. The dog took one slow step toward the stairs. Another. Then he stopped at the bottom, every muscle tight beneath his coat. A low sound rolled from his chest. Not fear. Not anger. Recognition. Ethan had heard that sound only a handful of times before. Once beneath a collapsed building overseas. Once when a gas line leaked beneath an old farmhouse. Ranger never growled without a reason. The cabin fell completely silent. Even the wind outside seemed to fade away. Ethan looked back toward the locked attic door. Somewhere deep inside the old house, a floorboard gave a soft, lonely creak. Ranger's eyes never left the darkness above them. Then, for the first time since they had arrived, the old dog began to growl. Ethan stood without moving, his eyes fixed on the narrow staircase while the low growl continued to roll from Ranger's chest. The sound was steady, controlled, the same warning the old dog had given years ago whenever something hidden rested beneath the surface of an ordinary place. He had learned long ago that Ranger never wasted fear. The fading sunlight slipped through the dusty windows behind them, stretching long golden lines across the worn floorboards. Tiny particles drifted through the air like slow falling snow. The cabin remained perfectly still. Ethan reached down and rested one hand against the dog's neck. The thick fur beneath his fingers felt warm, but every muscle was tight. "Easy boy," he whispered softly. Ranger did not look at him. His amber eyes stayed locked on the attic door. Ethan followed the dog's gaze once more. The iron lock hanging from the handle seemed strangely out of place. Everything else in the cabin carried the quiet marks of passing decades. The fireplace stones were chipped. The table had rings left by forgotten coffee mugs. The rocking chair near the window creaked gently whenever the wind slipped through the old walls. But the lock looked newer, cleaner, almost as if someone had placed it there only a few years before. He climbed the first step carefully. The old wood answered with a long groan. Ranger immediately moved beside him, close enough that his shoulder brushed Ethan's leg. Together they climbed until they stood only a few feet from the door. Ethan reached toward the lock, but stopped before touching it. The metal felt wrong somehow. Not dangerous, simply colder than it should have been. He wrapped his fingers around it anyway. The chill spread into his hand like water from a mountain stream. He gave the lock a gentle pull. It did not move. A small brass tag hung from one side, nearly hidden beneath a layer of dust. Ethan brushed it clean with his thumb. There were only 3 faded letters stamped into the metal. E.C. He frowned. Those were his own initials. Ethan Calloway. He looked again, wondering if the weak light was playing tricks on him. The letters remained exactly the same. Ranger let out a soft whine and backed down one step, his ears turning toward the hallway. Below, Ethan listened. Nothing. Only the quiet sigh of wind outside and the faint settling sounds of an old building growing colder with evening. He forced a small smile and slipped the tag back into place. Maybe it belonged to another man with the same initials. Maybe it meant nothing at all. He had spent enough nights under open skies to know that loneliness could make ordinary things feel mysterious. He turned away from the attic and descended the stairs. Ranger followed, but the dog kept looking over his shoulder every few seconds as if expecting the door to open on its own. Ethan unpacked a small lantern from his backpack and placed it on the old table. Soon a warm amber glow filled the room, pushing the shadows toward the corners. He opened a can of vegetable soup and heated it over a portable camp stove while Ranger lay near the fireplace. Outside, darkness settled across Black Hollow Ridge. The tops of the pine trees swayed against a sky filled with early stars. It should have felt peaceful. It was exactly the kind of silence Ethan had driven hundreds of miles to find. Yet the cabin carried a strange weight, as though it had been waiting through countless winters for someone to return. He finished eating and spread out his old army blanket near the fire. Ranger usually fell asleep before he did, but not that night. The German shepherd remained awake, his ears lifting now and then toward the ceiling. The lantern flame flickered softly. Somewhere above them, deep beyond the locked attic door, a single quiet sound drifted through the old wood. It was not a knock. It was not a footstep. It sounded almost like a rocking chair moving gently back and forth. Ethan did not remember falling asleep. One moment he had been watching the lantern throw its gentle light across the old beams, and the next he opened his eyes to darkness and the soft crackling of dying embers inside the fireplace. The cabin felt different. The air carried the faint scent of pine and old paper, as though someone had opened a forgotten trunk somewhere deep inside the walls. Ranger was no longer lying beside the fire. The German shepherd stood at the foot of the staircase, perfectly still, his head tilted toward the ceiling. Moonlight slipped through the window and rested across his silver and cream coat, giving him the quiet appearance of an old guardian carved from stone. Ethan reached for his watch. It was a little after 2 in the morning. Outside, the wind had settled. The forest was silent. Even the branches that had scratched against the roof earlier now stood motionless beneath the stars. Ranger looked back at him for only a second before turning his attention upward again. Then he climbed the first stair. Ethan sat up slowly. The old army instincts he thought he had left behind returned without asking permission. He listened carefully. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. Only the distant creak of old wood adjusting to the cold mountain air. Ranger climbed another step. Then another. He stopped halfway and lowered his nose toward the railing. The dog sniffed the air carefully before letting out a quiet breath. It was not the warning growl from earlier. It was softer, almost thoughtful. Ethan stood and picked up the lantern. Its warm light chased away the darkness around him as he followed Ranger toward the attic. Every stair answered beneath their weight with a slow complaint. Halfway up, Ethan noticed something he had not seen before. Dust covered every step except one. The seventh board looked cleaner than the others, as though countless shoes had touched it over the years while the rest had been forgotten. He crouched and brushed his fingers across the wood. The dust came away easily. Beneath it, faint scratches crossed the surface. They were not random. Someone had carved a small shape there long ago. A pine tree inside a circle. Ranger touched the carving gently with one paw and looked at Ethan. The symbol stirred a memory he could not quite reach. During his years repairing barns across the northern states, he had seen old ranch brands and family crests, but this was different. It felt older, simpler, like a promise someone had left behind. He stood and continued upward. When they reached the landing, the lantern light settled once again across the locked door. The brass tag still hung from the iron lock. E.C. Ethan stared at the letters for several long seconds. Then he noticed something else. The paint around the handle had worn away in a perfect circle, as though hands had turned it thousands of times. Yet the dust beneath the door remained untouched. It made no sense. Ranger stepped closer. His nose moved along the bottom edge of the door before stopping near the right corner. He scratched the floor once, then twice. Ethan lowered the lantern. There, almost hidden beneath years of dirt, lay a narrow line in the wood. He rubbed it clean. It was not part of the floor. It was a seam. A small square panel had been built into the landing itself. His heartbeat slowed rather than quickened. He had learned long ago that the truth often waited beneath ordinary things. He reached for the edge of the panel and pulled gently. It opened without resistance. Inside rested a single object wrapped in faded blue cloth. Ethan lifted it carefully and unfolded the fabric. A small brass key slipped into his palm. Ranger sat down beside him, and, for the first time since they had arrived at the cabin, his tail moved once against the old wooden floor. The little brass key rested quietly in Ethan's palm, its edges worn smooth by hands that had long since disappeared into memory. It was heavier than it looked, old enough that the metal had taken on the soft color of autumn wheat. Ranger leaned forward and sniffed it once. The dog did not growl. Instead, he let out a slow breath and looked back toward the locked attic door. Ethan studied the key carefully. On one side, almost hidden beneath years of age, was the same symbol they had found carved into the stair. A pine tree inside a circle. He slipped the key into his jacket pocket and stood. Outside, the first light of dawn had begun to touch the mountains. Pale blue shadows stretched across the forest while a gentle mist drifted between the pines, wrapping their trunks like old gray blankets. The cabin felt less lonely now, not because he understood it, but because mysteries had a strange way of making a place feel alive. Ethan opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The cold morning air carried the scent of wet earth and cedar. Ranger followed and stood beside him. Far below, a narrow valley rested beneath the rising sun. It was beautiful in the quiet way forgotten places often were. Ethan poured a little water into the dog's bowl and sat on the old porch step. He had spent enough years rebuilding broken things to know patience mattered. Old locks did not like force. Old stories did not reveal themselves all at once. He waited until the sun climbed above the trees before returning inside. The golden light spilling through the windows pushed away the last of the night's shadows. Ranger was already standing at the staircase. His ears pointed forward, his tail still, his eyes fixed upward. Ethan climbed slowly. The wooden steps seemed less uncertain beneath his boots now. When they reached the landing, he took the brass key from his pocket and held it beside the iron lock. They looked as though they had been made together. The key slid into place without resistance. Ethan paused. His hand rested on the cold metal while the cabin remained perfectly silent around him. He could hear his own breathing. He could hear the distant call of a bird somewhere outside. Ranger moved closer until his shoulder touched Ethan's leg. The old soldier smiled faintly. "All right, partner," he whispered. "Let's see what you've been trying to tell me." He turned the key. A soft click echoed through the narrow hallway. The sound was small, yet somehow it seemed to travel through the entire cabin. The lock released easily and hung loose against the door. Ethan reached for the handle. The old wood opened with a long, tired sigh. Lantern light was no longer needed. Morning sunlight slipped through a small round window at the far end of the attic, filling the room with a warm golden glow. Dust floated lazily through the beams of light. The space was almost empty. There were no old trunks stacked to the ceiling. No forgotten furniture. Only a single wooden rocking chair facing the window and a narrow bookshelf built into the wall beside it. Ranger stepped inside first. He walked past the chair without stopping. He ignored the shelves. His nose moved slowly across the floorboards until he reached the far corner beneath the window. Then, he sat down. Ethan looked around carefully. The attic was smaller than he had imagined. The walls were built from thick pine planks darkened by age. A folded wool blanket rested across the rocking chair, untouched by dust. That alone made his heart pause. Everything else carried the weight of 50 forgotten years. The blanket looked as though someone had placed it there only yesterday. Ranger lowered his head and touched the floor with his nose. Ethan knelt beside him. The boards beneath the dog were slightly different from the rest. Narrower, cleaner. He brushed away a thin layer of dust with the side of his hand. Another seam appeared in the wood. It was not a crack from age. It was the outline of a hidden door built directly into the attic floor. Ranger looked up at Ethan, and for the first time since they had arrived at the cabin, the old German shepherd slowly wagged his tail twice. The outline of the hidden door was so carefully built that no ordinary visitor would ever have noticed it. Ethan ran his hand along the narrow edge while Ranger remained beside him, calm now, his quiet confidence replacing the uneasiness that had filled the cabin since they arrived. The old German shepherd lowered one paw onto the wooden panel as though he had finally reached the place he had been searching for all along. Ethan looked around the attic once more. The rocking chair stood motionless beside the window, the folded blanket resting across its back. Sunlight poured through the round glass and painted the floor with soft gold. It did not feel like a place of fear. It felt like a room someone had cared for deeply. He slipped his fingers beneath the small iron ring hidden inside the floor and pulled upward. The panel lifted slowly with almost no effort. A faint scent drifted into the room, not of damp earth or decay, but of cedar wood, old books, and something sweet he could not immediately place. It reminded him of the small library his mother used to take him to when he was a boy. Beneath the opening was a narrow ladder leading downward into darkness. Ranger stood and looked at Ethan, waiting. "Looks like you were right again," Ethan said softly. He picked up the lantern from beside the rocking chair, lit it, and carefully started down. The hidden space was not large. It was more like a quiet room tucked between the attic and the walls of the cabin itself. The ceiling was low enough that Ethan had to bend slightly. Shelves lined the far side, each one filled with neatly stacked journals wrapped in faded cloth. A small desk stood beneath another tiny window no bigger than a dinner plate. Dust rested across everything except the chair in front of the desk. That chair looked almost untouched. Ranger climbed down behind him and walked directly toward the desk. He sniffed once, then sat quietly. Ethan lifted the lantern higher. On the desk rested a single wooden box. It was simple, made from polished pine, with the same tree symbol carved into the lid. There was no lock, only a folded piece of paper tucked beneath a leather strap. Ethan picked it up carefully. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained clear. "If you have found this place, then the old shepherd trusted you. That means I can trust you too." Ethan stared at the words. His eyes drifted toward Ranger, who simply watched him with calm amber eyes. The message continued. "The world believes this cabin was abandoned, but homes are never truly empty when they are built with love. I left no children behind, only memories, and I prayed that one day someone carrying the same quiet heart would walk through that front door." Ethan lowered the letter for a moment. The room around him felt strangely peaceful. Outside, a gentle breeze moved through the pines, and somewhere beyond the walls a wind chime gave a single soft note. He opened the wooden box. Inside was not gold or silver. There was an old army compass, a faded photograph of a younger man sitting beside a German shepherd, and beneath them a thick leather journal tied with a blue ribbon. Ethan picked up the photograph first. The man looked to be about 40 years old, broad-shouldered, with tired eyes and a week's worth of stubble across his jaw. Beside him sat the dog, proud and alert. Ethan felt his breath catch. The animal's silver and cream coat looked almost identical to Ranger's. Even the small mark near the left ear was the same. Ranger stepped closer and gently touched the old photograph with his nose before looking back at Ethan, as though he had been waiting his entire life to show him this forgotten room. The photograph remained in Ethan's hands for a long time. The more he looked at it, the more impossible it seemed. The man wore an old canvas field jacket much like the one hanging in Ethan's truck, and the German shepherd beside him carried the same quiet expression that Ranger often wore when he watched the horizon. There was no fear in those eyes. Only patience. Only trust. Ranger sat beside the little desk and looked from the picture to Ethan, almost as if he recognized an old friend. Ethan carefully placed the photograph back inside the wooden box and untied the blue ribbon around the leather journal. The cover was worn smooth by years of use, and when he opened it, the first page revealed a simple line written in careful handwriting. "My name is Samuel Mercer, and if this book has found you, then the mountain has decided that your journey and mine belong to the same story." Ethan slowly lowered himself into the old chair. Sunlight from the tiny window spilled across the pages, and dust drifted lazily through the beam like tiny stars. Ranger rested his head against Ethan's knee. The journal spoke of a former Army engineer who had returned from service carrying more silence than words. Samuel had built the cabin with his own hands, cutting timber from the surrounding forest and shaping each beam as a promise that one day he would find peace. But the pages were not filled with loneliness. They were filled with gratitude. Samuel wrote about neighbors who brought him soup during hard winters, children who stopped to hear old stories, and a faithful German shepherd named Boone who never left his side. Ethan smiled faintly when he reached those passages. Boone had a habit of scratching twice at the front door whenever someone in need was about to arrive. Samuel claimed the old dog could hear kindness before it reached the porch. Ranger lifted his ears as though the words themselves had touched something deep inside him. Ethan turned another page. A small folded map slipped free and landed softly on the desk. It showed the cabin, the creek below the ridge, and several trails through the forest. One place had been marked with the same pine tree symbol they had seen throughout the house. Beside it, Samuel had written, "The heart of this place is not built from stone or wood. It lives where people choose to care for one another." Ethan unfolded the map completely. The marked place rested only a short walk behind the cabin near a small clearing. He looked toward the tiny window. Through the trees, he could just make out a patch of sunlight touching the hillside. Ranger stood before Ethan could say a word. The dog walked to the ladder leading back into the attic, then looked over his shoulder. Ethan laughed quietly, the sound surprising even himself. It had been a long time since laughter had come so easily. He closed the journal with care and placed it back inside the wooden box, keeping only the map and the old army compass. As they climbed back into the attic, the rocking chair by the window moved almost imperceptibly, not enough to frighten him, just enough to catch his eye. A gentle breeze had entered through the round window, carrying the scent of pine needles and fresh earth. Ethan draped the wool blanket over one arm and walked toward the stairs. Ranger reached the attic doorway first, then paused. He looked back one final time at the hidden room before continuing down. It felt less like they were leaving a secret behind and more like they had been invited to carry a small part of it with them into the light. The trail behind the cabin was narrower than Ethan expected, little more than a quiet path winding between ancient pines whose branches filtered the morning light into long ribbons of gold. Fallen needles softened every step, and the forest carried that familiar mountain scent of cedar, moss, and clean earth after a cold night. Ranger moved ahead without hesitation. His tail stayed low, his ears alert, but there was no tension left in him now. It was almost as though the old dog knew exactly where they were supposed to go. Ethan kept Samuel's map folded inside his jacket pocket, though he found himself looking at it less and less. The farther they walked, the more he trusted Ranger instead. After nearly 10 minutes, the trees began to open. A small clearing appeared at the edge of a gentle hillside, where sunlight poured down like warm honey through the branches above. In the center stood a single stone well covered by a weathered wooden roof. Wildflowers had grown around its base, and vines wrapped themselves gently across the old beams. It did not look abandoned. It looked protected. Ranger walked straight toward it and sat quietly beside the stones. Ethan pulled out the map and unfolded it again. The pine tree symbol rested exactly where the well stood. He approached slowly and looked inside. There was no water, only darkness and a faint cool breeze rising from below. Hanging from one of the support beams was a small brass bell. Time had covered it with a soft green patina, yet when the wind touched it, the bell answered with a clear, gentle note, that seemed far too bright for something so old. Ethan remembered the words from Samuel's journal. The heart of this place is not built from stone or wood. It lives where people choose to care for one another. He rested his hand against the rough stones surrounding the well. One rock felt smoother than the others. He pushed gently. At first nothing happened. Then a quiet click echoed beneath his fingers. A section of the stone ring shifted inward, revealing a narrow compartment hidden inside the wall. Ranger stood immediately and looked into the opening. There was no treasure chest waiting inside. No stacks of money or forgotten jewels. Only a small metal tin and another leather journal, wrapped carefully inside oilcloth to protect it from the years. Ethan lifted it out with both hands. The tin beneath it rattled softly. He opened the lid. Inside rested dozens of folded letters, each tied with simple pieces of twine. Names were written across them in fading ink. Some belonged to children. Some belonged to soldiers. Some belonged to widows and old friends. Ethan opened one at random. Thank you for fixing our roof before winter. My boys still talk about the kind man with the shepherd. Another read. Thank you for bringing my husband home when everyone else had given up looking. Ethan slowly looked around the clearing. The old well was not hiding riches. It was protecting gratitude. Samuel had spent his life helping people and had quietly kept every letter they had ever sent him. Ranger lowered his head and touched the stack of letters gently with his nose. Ethan opened the second journal. On the very first page Samuel had written, "If you are reading this, then Boone brought you here, even if many years have passed since he closed his eyes. Some friendships, especially the ones built on loyalty, never truly leave this world." Ethan looked down at Ranger. The old German shepherd was staring into the trees beyond the clearing, and for a brief moment Ethan could have sworn another shepherd was standing there in the sunlight, silent and watchful, before the wind moved through the branches and the figure became nothing more than dancing light among the pines. The clearing remained quiet long after the strange shape among the trees had faded into the morning light. Ethan stood without speaking, the old journal resting in his hands while Ranger stayed close beside him. The breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers across the hillside, and the little brass bell above the well answered with another soft note. It was almost as though the mountain itself had been listening. Ethan opened the journal again and carefully turned the page. Samuel's handwriting remained steady and clear. If you have reached this place, then you have already discovered that the greatest things we leave behind are not the things we own. They are the people who remember that we cared. Beneath the words was a list of names. There were dozens of them. Families, veterans, children. Beside each name Samuel had written a short note. New roof before winter. School books delivered. Medical bills paid. Fence repaired after the storm. Ethan slowly realized what he was holding. The old man had spent years quietly helping strangers and had never asked for anything in return. Ranger lowered his head and nudged the journal gently, as if asking him to keep reading. A folded envelope slipped from the final pages. Across the front, written in dark blue ink, were only 4 words. For the next caretaker. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside was a letter and a small iron key, unlike the brass one from the attic. This key was older, rougher, shaped by hand instead of machine. The letter read, "If you are reading this, then Boone chose well. I learned long ago that dogs see the truth before we do. They do not care about money, titles, or the mistakes people carry. They simply know when a heart is still capable of kindness. If your shepherd brought you here, then this cabin belongs to you now. Not because you bought it, but because you listened." Ethan looked around the clearing. The words settled over him more deeply than he expected. Since leaving the army, he had spent years believing he was simply drifting from one temporary place to another. Yet somehow an old cabin, a forgotten soldier, and a loyal dog had led him exactly where he needed to be. He turned the letter over. One final sentence had been written across the back. "The last gift is waiting where the light reaches the water." Ethan unfolded the map once more. Near the edge of the clearing, a narrow blue line marked a small spring hidden deeper in the woods. The same pine tree symbol had been drawn beside it. Ranger stood immediately. His ears lifted toward the eastern trail, and for the first time since they had arrived at Black Hollow Ridge, he let out one short bark. Not a warning, not a growl. It sounded almost like an invitation. Ethan slipped the letters, the journal, and the small iron key safely into his pack. Together they walked toward the path beyond the clearing while the morning sun climbed higher through the pines. When they reached the edge of the trees, Ethan glanced back one last time. The old brass bell above the well moved gently even though the wind had stopped. Its clear voice echoed across the hillside, and somewhere beyond the light and shadows, he thought he heard the distant sound of another shepherd answering from the forest. The path to the spring curved gently through the forest until the trees opened one last time. Sunlight poured across a small pool of clear water that rested beneath a circle of ancient pines. The surface was so still that it reflected the sky like polished glass. Ranger walked ahead, his steps slow and certain, until he reached a flat stone near the water's edge. He sat down and looked at Ethan. The old German shepherd had guided him across miles of lonely roads, through storms, through long nights when memories had seemed heavier than the world itself. Now there was a quiet peace in the dog's eyes that Ethan had never seen before. He took the iron key from his pocket and looked around the clearing. At first there was nothing unusual. Then the morning sun climbed a little higher, and a narrow beam of light touched the side of the stone where Ranger sat. Hidden beneath a curtain of moss was a small iron door set into the rock itself. Ethan knelt and brushed the moss away. The old key fit perfectly. The lock opened with a gentle click. Inside was a single wooden chest no larger than a toolbox. He lifted it carefully and carried it into the sunlight. Ranger remained beside him, watching quietly. Ethan opened the lid. There was no fortune hidden inside. No stacks of money. No jewels. Instead, he found a bundle of property papers, the original deed to the cabin and the surrounding land, along with one final letter. The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he unfolded it. My friend, if you have reached this place, then you already understand what Boone spent his whole life trying to teach me. A faithful heart always knows where it belongs. This cabin was never meant to become a monument to one old soldier. It was meant to become a refuge for those who have forgotten that kindness still exists. I leave it to you because your shepherd believed in you, and because somewhere along the way, I learned to trust his judgment more than my own. Ethan lowered the letter and looked across the quiet water. The mountain breeze moved gently through the pines, carrying the scent of cedar and fresh earth. For the first time in many years, he did not feel like a man passing through someone else's story. He felt like he had finally come home. The weeks that followed changed the old cabin in small but meaningful ways. Ethan repaired the porch. He fixed the windows. He cleared the trail behind the house and placed a wooden sign at the entrance that simply read, "Welcome, friend." Travelers began to stop by. An old rancher with a broken fence. A widow whose roof needed patching before winter. A young veteran looking for a quiet place to breathe again. Ethan never asked for payment. Sometimes they left behind a pie. Sometimes a bag of coffee. Sometimes only a smile and a thank you. Ranger greeted every visitor the same way Samuel's old journal had described Boone greeting strangers, with quiet eyes and a gentle heart. One autumn evening, nearly a year after Ethan first arrived, he climbed to the attic and sat in the old rocking chair beside the round window. The wool blanket still rested across its back. The hidden room remained exactly as they had found it, peaceful and untouched. Ranger lay at his feet while the last light of the day slipped through the trees outside. A soft breeze moved through the open window, and somewhere beyond the cabin a brass bell rang once across the mountains. Ranger lifted his head for a moment, his tail brushing softly against the floorboards. Then he closed his eyes again. Ethan smiled and looked toward the quiet forest. Some people spend their whole lives searching for a miracle. Others discover that the miracle was simply being led home by a loyal friend who knew the way long before they did.